One of the lingering criticisms of the Israeli government's response has been the need for better public diplomacy, arguing the case for the action against Hamas. It's often left to people like you and I to front the debate. Our first guest is a fierce defender of Israel who's worked for the government at its highest levels. He's committed to helping spread the word on how to counter many of the lies and misrepresentations about what's going on. Meet Eylon Levy, the former Israeli government spokesman and the former international media advisor at the Office of the President of Israel, as well as being the host of the program State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead. I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy.
Since the October 7 massacre, I've given hundreds of interviews covering every continent on Earth, bar Antarctica.
The actions of Israel have gone beyond legitimate retaliation.
What happens when the current 4-day pause ends?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go now?
The international community says you are the problem.
Yeah, the last 6 months have been surreal, not least for Israel, which has found itself plunged into a war none of us could have imagined, but for me personally as well. I was a private citizen when the war started. It was such a state of emergency that it was all hands on deck, everyone joining the war effort in whatever way they could. And for me, that meant coming on board as a government spokesman, which was an especially surreal twist, because until not long before the war, I'd been protesting against the government, but Hamas attacked us, massacred 1,200 people, and the country needed all the help it could get. And what I tried to do as a government spokesman, which was my position for the first 6 months of the war, was to try to reinvent the role, because you can't play by the rules and expect to have any headway in the international media, given how much hostility there is, given how few people really want to listen to Israel's story. So we invested in social media and creating reels, especially for Instagram, to blur the line between being a government spokesman and between being a content creator. We set up White House-style press conferences from the Israeli Defense Ministry to try to make information more accessible to the media.
Elon, if we didn't know it before, we certainly know now that this is a war on two fronts. There's a real-time war in Gaza and there's the war in the media. With 15 million Jews and 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second that every Muslim endorses what Hamas did on October the 7th, because that's absolutely not the case. But if this is a numbers game, we are at a decided disadvantage. Can we talk about the unevenness and profound challenges of the information battlefield?
Wow, you say it's a war on two fronts. It's a war on 8 fronts, because Israel is being attacked simultaneously,
True.
not only by Hamas in Gaza, terrorism from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. There has been a full-scale war with Hezbollah from Lebanon for the last 7 months, rockets from Syria, rockets from Iraq, rockets from Yemen, a massive ballistic missile attack from Iran, and on top of that, assaults on the Jewish diaspora around the world. The core of the conflict remains that Israel is still surrounded by people who want to kill it and wipe it off the map. That hasn't changed, and until that dynamic changes, the Middle East conflict is going to endure. But you're right, there is a physical war and there is an information war. And the information war is so difficult because Hamas has been so masterful at playing the international media. Human rights organizations and NGOs that have been weaponized against Israel. That means it's not an even fight at all. Just take the story from the beginning of the war of the Al-Ahli hospital. Hamas claimed that an Israeli airstrike hit a hospital, destroyed it, and killed exactly 500.3 people. The sun came up in the morning. It turned out it was an Islamic Jihad rocket. Maybe dozens of people were killed, and the hospital was still standing. It hit a car park. But that story had already gone around the world and people believed it. And unfortunately, the international media has not learned the lesson and keeps getting played by propaganda that Hamas throws out without checking the sources and realizing there is no free media in Gaza. Gaza is an authoritarian state controlled by Hamas, and all the information that comes out is mediated through the brutal terror organization that massacred and abducted civilians on October 7th and has spent every waking moment since then denying that they did it in the first place.
As we observed the proceedings at the International Court of Justice in late December 2023, it felt as if we were literally living in a parallel universe. South Africa's egregious case was designed to inoculate Hamas from genocidal claims against it, and instead it managed somehow to invert the truth to portray Israel as the illegitimate aggressor. Eylon, I have to ask you this. When did facts stop having any currency? And how can we effectively combat the forces working against Israel's right to self-defence?
You talk about a parallel universe. Look how absurd it's become in just the last few days. Egypt decided to join South Africa's ridiculous claims of genocide against Israel. At the same time, Egypt is refusing to allow humanitarian aid trucks through the Rafah crossing. And it's refusing to allow aid trucks to reach the Israeli crossings to get into Gaza. So Egypt is accusing Israel of genocide while actively preventing food from getting into Gaza. It's ridiculous. Your head wants to explode. But look at the information that the ICJ based its initial decision on. Who does it quote? UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency that is a front for Hamas, that recruits terrorists on a massive scale, terrorists who took part in the October 7 massacre. The same UNRWA that had a Hamas server farm located 20 meters underneath its main headquarters in Gaza and was supplying it electricity. The same UNRWA that just yesterday Israel revealed Hamas had a war room from inside an UNRWA school. And more than that, we released footage, and I hope you play this, of Hamas gunmen opening fire from right next to UN vehicles. UNRWA is not only complicit with Hamas, it is an integral part of Hamas's war effort. And this is the organization that so many people in the ICJ, in the international media, will quote as being the United Nations, as if this is some saintly voice coming from the heavens, instead of an organization that is in league with Hamas and committed to Hamas's ultimate vision of the violent destruction of the state of Israel.
Eylon, tell me this, how does having the UN imprimatur give these organisations legitimacy when all they do is speak nonsense, incite violence and radicalise a people? I mean, I need someone to explain this to me.
The United Nations enjoys a huge amount of moral authority around the world, even though it is a club of 193 countries, most of which are not even democracies. Most members of the United Nations are not democracies, and it shows, because the one thing that they can agree on across all their disagreements is that they don't like Israel. And so Israel plays a role at the United Nations of being the one issue that all these countries can coalesce around and push Israel around so they can avoid dealing with their own problems. Hamas uses the UN to launder its information. I'll give you a crazy example from the start of the war. About 10 days into the war, UNRWA tweeted that Hamas had stolen supplies from an UNRWA warehouse. They then deleted the tweet and put out a clarification denying reports on social media. What reports? Their own tweet. Now, I then had to go on, I think it was a BBC radio interview, and they said, UNRWA promises that it won't let Hamas steal supplies. I said, what are you talking about? UNRWA admitted that Hamas is stealing supplies. And you see that across the whole of Gaza, that Hamas controls the distribution of aid in Gaza and the UN is covering it up. But because people still think of the moral authority of the United Nations and the vision and the ideals and the values that it is supposed to represent, they cannot bring themselves to believe that the Palestinian aid workers on the ground in Gaza are in league with the organization that is extremely popular among the Palestinian people in Gaza. And that's the reality of the situation there.
You've said recently that Israel's allies understand that this war has to end with the hostages home. Eylon, you're witnessing, as am I, as is the world, the increasing international pressure on Israel. Pressure that's included Senator Chuck Schumer questioning the legitimacy of the democratically elected Netanyahu coalition. You've seen Biden's conspicuous departure from his staunch, unequivocal support for Israel that seems to have shifted ever since his State of the Union address, culminating in a recent undertaking to suspend arms shipments to Israel in the middle of a defensive war. You've seen countries, including my own, rewarding Hamas for its anti-Semitic terror with its recent vote in favour of Palestine UN membership. What makes you hopeful, if you are in fact hopeful, that Israel's allies are not about to pull the pin and say, we offered resolute support initially, but the catastrophic images coming out of Gaza are simply too much for our political base to take?
We need to get those hostages home, and we need to destroy Hamas so that it can never take hostages again. Now, every piece of additional pressure that the world puts on Israel buries those hostages an additional foot underground. Hamas needs a reason to agree to a hostage deal. And it needs to be given a reason to agree to a hostage deal because it will fear that it's going to get pummeled. And if Hamas thinks that the international community will do its work for it by pressuring Israel to leave Hamas standing in Rafah, then it has no reason to let the hostages go at all. And you know what? British Foreign Secretary David Cameron addressed this. He was asked, why don't you put an arms embargo on Israel? And he said, because that would only strengthen Hamas and make a hostage deal less likely. So we need more pressure on Hamas. That vote at the United Nations to advance the status of the so-called state of Palestine, outrageous. Palestinians must not be allowed to look back at October 7th as their Independence Day. They cannot be allowed to think that gang rape and burning whole families alive advance their national cause. They have to understand that terrorism is a dead end and there is no light at the end of that tunnel.
You mentioned the Al-Ali hospital, you mentioned the UN's reversal of the figures that they have been spouting and parroting for the last 7 months. How can we possibly course correct, Eylon?
I think that Israel needs to do a much better job of fighting the information war because it is a war. And at the moment, that is not a war that is being budgeted with the right ammunition and protective gear. Israel needs a fleet of elite spokespeople, professional, paid, full-time, in every language. No other country in the world needs to explain itself 24/7 all the time because people are disputing its basic legitimacy. We need full-time spokespeople in English, French, Spanish, German, Farsi, Arabic, Norwegian and Swedish, and the fact it hasn't happened yet is outrageous. We need to be better at crisis communications. We need to be better at getting information out there to our allies, especially in the Jewish diaspora, but also to allies around the world who want to fight our corner. But we can't get around the fact that the odds are stacked against us, and they're stacked against us because there are far more of them than there are of us, and they're stacked against us because the Palestinian side uses tactics of violence and intimidation in the worst case, and they're threatening, to cancel people and make them, not wanted in polite society at worse. And there are many people who support Israel, who understand that the deadliest terror attack in world history after 9/11 and the taking of hostages, the answer cannot be to leave Hamas to fight another day, but they are scared to speak up for Israel because of what the consequences will be. And we need to hold them by the hand and help them understand what the consequences for them will be. That the craziness that we are seeing on the streets of Canada and Australia and the Western world and university campuses, this is not the future that you want for yourselves and for your societies. And that if you allow Hamas to live another day after this war, you will only be encouraging future acts of terrorism and atrocities, and you do not want that on your hands. You do not want that on your conscience. You do not want to embolden the Islamist terrorist extremists who see you in the Western world as being as much an enemy as us, and you do not want them to finish us off because we know and you know that they will come after you next.
Eylon, your consistent, passionate and exceptional advocacy is what has gotten so many of us through this darkest of times. You've reminded us and decent people everywhere that irrespective of the propaganda, the spin and the outright malicious falsehoods, we remain the sane ones in the asylum. So thank you. Eylon Levy, wonderful to have you on Show of Force. We look forward to having you back again very soon.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Tam.